I'm very happy to be taking part of this sister project collaboration between Sierra and GenderSAFE. To get us started, I will share my screen. So just let me know if you can see it. So can you see it? Yeah, because I cannot see you. So
Yep.
if there's anything wrong, just let me know. So again, it's great to be here. Today we're going to be talking about gender-based violence in academia and its integration into gender equality plans. To get an overview of today's session, the idea is for us to first talk about the key concepts on gender-based violence, and I will present to you the 7P model. Then we will go on to a brief break, and afterwards we are going to do a group exercise and share our experiences in a plenary session. So because of the recording and the technical aspects, I will be presenting all of the key concepts together, but don't worry because we will have time to discuss all of them during the plenary session. Just to add on to Kiki's ground rules today, I'd just like to encourage you to be curious and ask questions, but also keep your answers to the point, so as a way of respecting everybody's time. And of course, we try to keep this as a safe space, so please treat others' experiences with respect and confidentiality. Just a note on today's session that this is an introductory session. So we're going to cover the basics and we aim to build a shared foundation for everybody. Because we're trying to support a wide range of needs and perspectives, please keep in mind that there may be different levels of experience with the topic. And yes, we will be focusing only on academic environments. In relation to content, I would also like to warn you that in this session, we will be talking about situations that refer to violation of personal boundaries or experiences of harm or power dynamics. So if at any point you feel uncomfortable, you're more than welcome to step out of the room, to pause, or to engage in whatever feels safest and most supportive for you. No one will ask any questions. And in that same direction, we ask you to assume that there are survivors in the room. So you are more than welcome to ask questions and make mistakes, but please be very careful of dismissive or skeptical comments about other people's experiences. Because if that happens, the facilitators and I will intervene. It's just not to single anyone out. It's nothing personal. It's just part of how we hold this space together. So, going now into the content of our session. What brings us together here are the gender equality plans, and because you are already working on these, you know that they are a set of commitments and actions that aim to promote gender equality in an organization through a process of structural change. Now, you're aware that we use them as policy instruments, transforming organizational cultures and aiming to reduce gender inequalities. In the context of Horizon Europe, there have been set out mandatory GEP process-related requirements, but there are also content areas that have been recommended by Horizon Europe. And it is these 5 key areas that you see on the slide, and one of them is exactly measures against gender-based violence, including sexual harassment. So this would be our starting point. This is the motive behind today's session. In the Horizon Europe guidance, you always will find that Horizon Europe says that a gender equality plan should look into what measures the organization takes to combat gender-based violence. And they recommend looking into all of these points that you see on the slide. So today we're going to be talking about all of them. I assure you that we will cover all of these points for sure. But I would just like you to present this in a way of framing our discussion and having this as our starting point. I'd like to point your attention to this last point where Horizon Europe says that organizations may consider a culture of zero tolerance towards gender-based violence. And this is specifically something that the 2025 guidance has included. But if you are wondering exactly what would a zero tolerance culture look like, then I'd like to point you to this first document. This is the Zero Tolerance Code of Conduct. This document was developed by the ERA Forum subgroup on inclusive gender equality in close cooperation with the Commission. It is a document that wants to set out a common approach, as well as definitions and stakeholders' responsibilities all across the European research area. So it is a very important document as a starting point, because if you're asking yourself, what does zero tolerance look like for my organization? You can find here a list of 20 principles structured around 3 pillars of action, commitment, and accountability. Now, as Kiki said, afterwards, you're going to receive all of the slides. So I leave here for you the link in case you want to go deeper into this document. But returning to our GEP cycle, now you're already involved in these tasks, so you know that it has 4 basic phases of designing, or there are 4 basic phases in designing our gender equality plans. So the first one would consist of conducting an assessment of where your institution is, then moving forward to designing the plan itself, and as well as going to implement it, and afterwards monitor how all of these actions have been taking place. I want to say that today we're going to be focusing exclusively on the design phase. So zooming in on what the gender-based violence section of your gender equality plan might look like. So if this is a question some of you have in your head right now, you are designing the GEP of your institution and you want to know where to start, my first recommendation would be for you to start here by taking the GenderSAFE institutional self-assessment tool. You'll see throughout this presentation that I will present a lot of practical tips and a lot of tools that are already out there. This is one of the main ones. So this tool was developed in the context of the GenderSAFE project. It has been designed as a process to help institutions assess where they are in terms of gender-based violence. So what practices they have, what policies, or what supporting systems are already in place. If you take this tool, it will allow your institution to identify your areas of strength and gaps across multiple dimensions. You will understand your level of institutional development across 6 stages. And this is because the tool has classified 6 possible stages where your institution can be. And you will see afterwards that it ranges from starting point, project, inception, growth, and all the way up to integration and institutionalization of policies on gender-based violence. And after knowing where your institution is, you will receive tailored recommendations for improvement. So, how does this tool work? First of all, you are invited to complete the self-assessment. It's basically a series of questions and answers that cover a wide range of topics. Then also, you're welcome to discuss this internally and take the tool using your teams that are already in place in your institution, because it's very designed for allowing yourself to pause, to save your progress, and to take it back anytime that you wish. So there's no need to do it in one take. After you complete this assessment, you will receive a report, which includes a spider graph showing your performance across the different impact drivers, and of course, a description of where your institution is. And as a final step, you are invited to track your progress and monitor the different actions that your institution will implement in terms of gender-based violence. So that's why the recommendation is that you would ideally take the tool and the assessment around every 12 to 18 months. So if you want to, take the tool, I leave also for you here the link, and we can come back to it also and discuss any questions that you may have. So as a starting point, going into content specifically, I want to focus on explaining very clearly what we mean when we talk about gender-based violence. Now for this, GenderSAFE relies on the definition of the Council of Europe, affirming that gender-based violence refers to any type of harm that is perpetrated against a person or group of people because of their factual or perceived sex, gender, sexual orientation, and/or gender identity. It's important to keep in mind that from this perspective, gender-based violence can be perpetrated by anyone. So this means a former spouse or partner, a family member, a colleague from work, unknown people, or even intrastate institutions. This perspective of gender-based violence also encompasses different types and manifestations of how it expresses itself. So when we talk about violence, we cover all of these types. We include physical violence, which refer to the intentional use or of force against another person. So this may be kicking, beating, pushing. We also include psychological violence, or known often as emotional abuse, which involves intentional behaviors that undermine, manipulate, or control a person's feelings, actions. Of course, this can include anything from verbal abuse, blackmailing, threats. Economic and financial violence are also included in this definition because they are intentional acts that result in financial harm to an individual or make them financially dependent. So in a research context, for example, economic violence can manifest itself as denying access to financial resources, restricting employment opportunities, or withholding employment contracts. Of course, sexual violence is included, and this is where we include our definition of sexual harassment, because we define sexual violence as any sexual act that is perpetrated against someone's will. And what we typically define as quid pro quo sexual harassment occurs when studying or employment decisions are based on unaccepted or rejection of unwelcome sexual behaviors. And there's also gender harassment and organizational violence. Gender harassment refers to actions, comments that create a hostile or offensive environment and that are directed against a person because of their sex, gender identity, or gender expression. They don't necessarily have to be sexually explicit, but they can include, for example, sexist jokes, exclusion, stereotypical prejudice against people. And organizational violence. When we refer to this, we talk about what happens at the collective, at the group or organizational levels of research performing organizations. And of course, all of these can include in an online or in-person context, of course, for the exception of physical violence. So just to be clear, for us, gender-based violence occurs along a continuum, and I will go back to this in a minute. It is intersectional, because it acknowledges that it disproportionately impacts individuals who hold multiple identities. Now, I'm sure I don't have to go deeper into this concept because it's something that in Sierra you're already working for, but basically intersectionality helps us understand how different social identities, such as race, ethnicity, gender, sexuality, intersect with one another and shapes an individual's experience. And also, it's important to remember that a single act can constitute gender-based violence. So there's no repetition needed. And just to zoom in on what we mean by a continuum, I believe this is important because sometimes the term violence may cause some rejection at first. But it's important to say that when we talk about violence, we talk about harm. And the word itself doesn't carry an assessment of how severe a conduct is. And because violence is an encompassing term that for us captures all stages of a continuum. We talk about a continuum because we see that sometimes conducts that can seem innocent or mild tend to gradually escalate if they are not properly addressed. So to avoid this from happening, it's important that we see the whole picture from beginning to end. And the easiest way to illustrate this is by showing the iceberg of gender-based violence, with seemingly mild conducts at the bottom and more severe forms of violence at the top. So now that we have seen and agreed on this definition and shown our perspective, I'd like to present some facts and figures from the UNICEF survey. So the previous project, the one before GenderSAFE, it was called UNICEF, and it carried out the largest cross-cultural survey in the European research area on gender-based violence. They collected over 42,000 responses from staff and students across 46 research performing organizations in 15 countries. And today I'd like to present some of the results. So the essential result is that nearly 2 in 3 respondents have experienced gender-based violence. And on another hand, almost 1 in 3 of those respondents have experienced sexual harassment. So going also on the concept of intersectionality, the results of the survey show that respondents who identified as LGBTQ+, who reported a disability or chronic illness, and who belonged to an ethnic minority group were more likely to have experienced at least one incident of gender-based violence, compared to those who didn't identify with those characteristics. So if the question is gender-based violence a problem in the European research area, these figures demonstrate that it is. Of course, the survey was also interested in looking for the reasons behind not reporting, and this is because it showed an alarming fact that among respondents who had experienced gender-based violence, only 13% reported it. So the question comes, why? Why such a low reporting rate? So what victim survivors expressed was that they were unsure if the behavior was serious enough to report. Also, they showed that they did not recognize their behavior as violence at that time. And in the third place, they did not think anything would happen if they reported it. Of course, having experienced this in higher education institutions had its impact. And so we see here some work-related consequences for staff who felt dissatisfied with the job, who experienced work productivity, and even considered leaving the academic sector, but also study-related consequences for students. So experiencing missed classes, also dissatisfaction with their studies, and of course, reduced learning achievements because of what they had experienced. So we have agreed on the definition of gender-based violence. We have seen that evidence shows that this is an actual problem. And now I'd like to present just a little bit of the legal obligation behind addressing gender-based violence. And this is because Kiki and Vasily specifically asked that I incorporate a legal component, but it's also the perspective from where I see this issue. So if we want to talk about legal frameworks for addressing gender-based violence in academia, we see that there are different frameworks across different levels. So starting from the international level, where we have international conventions such as CEDAW, or you may have heard of the ILO Convention 190 that aims at preventing violence and harassment in the workplace. But there are also instruments that oblige institutions to act at the European level. So we have our Istanbul Convention, for example, who defines violence against women as a violation of human rights and a form of discrimination against women. But also there are a lot of EU directives, such as the Employment Equality Directive or Victims' Rights Directive, that also oblige employers and public authorities to prevent and redress such violence. And this includes higher education institutions. And if that were not enough, we can also see our instruments at the national level. I'm sure all of the countries where you're from have some sort of policy or legislation on gender-based violence in higher education and research. And if they don't have, they should. And if you're asking yourself, well, how would I know where my country stands on gender-based violence, on the sanctioning of these policies? I can redirect you to the UNICEF country reports and the GenderSAFE national policy monitoring. Now, during the course of these 2 projects, the research partners looked into how European countries were addressing this topic. And they published the first set of reports in the year 2021. And this is the map that you will find in the UNICEF website, but also conducted an update of this study in 2025 in autumn. So the second update was based on interviews across 18 countries, both EU countries and associating countries. The aim was to map policies, national laws, and any initiatives in place to show what progress was made and where we still need some. I went ahead and peeked a little bit at the countries of where our participants from the session are today. And I have to say that countries like Croatia, Slovakia, and Albania and Iceland are still considered emerging. So this means that they have broader national policies on gender-based violence, but they haven't paid any specific attention to higher education and research. So I would love to hear more about your experiences in your situations in your countries during our plenary. But if there is one legal concept that I would like you to walk out of here today is the duty of care. So why should my institution address gender-based violence? And the answer is because they have a duty of care. We have defined in our model policy framework, which I will explain what that is later on, the duty of care as a legal and ethical obligation for institutions to ensure the safety, well-being, and rights of all members of its community. So this duty encompasses several responsibilities and actions aimed at preventing, addressing, and responding to gender-based violence. And then it goes on to enumerate a series of actions. But please know that this is a legal term, and the obligation to address it comes from all of these legal frameworks that we've seen before. And it has both sides. It's applicable both towards employees and also to students. So we see here, for example, the EU Council Directive on Health and Safety that defines an obligation at the EU level related to health and safety in the workplace. But also it's applicable to students as well, because it is the topic of directives on equal treatment and consumer protection. Also considering that the regimes of public and private universities may be subject to different regulations, still there is this duty underlying actions of institutions. And now to our mostly interesting part is we've seen that what gender-based violence is. We know that this is a legal obligation, and we know that we have to act. But since we're all working on the gender equality plans, the question is how? And this is why I would like to bring here today the 7P model, which is a holistic framework adopted in the context of UNICEF, basically for the analysis, assessment, and development of policies at the institutional level aimed at addressing gender-based violence. So I'm going to present all of these Ps that make up the 7P model. And then I'm going to also provide some tips on how to implement them and some inspiring practices from institutions at the European level. Now, when we talk about the 7Ps, we talk about prevention, policy, protection, prevalence, provision of services, partnerships, and prosecution. You will also find that this model may be connected to the UN or EU's approach to addressing violence, but this is an enhanced version. So we can start with prevalence. So prevalence is focused on collecting data through specific surveys on gender-based violence or through adding questions to existing surveys that are run on a regular basis. So basically, when we talk about the prevalence of gender-based violence, we refer to the total number of individuals who have experienced it at a particular point in time or within a specific period, expressed as a proportion of the population. So prevalence includes all existing cases, both new and previously existing, during the period that we are measuring. If we wanted, for example, to add or focus specifically on prevalence in our GEPs, we could propose as an objective to diagnose the prevalence and manifestations of gender-based violence at the university. And as an action, we could go to designing and circulating a community-wide survey on experiences of gender-based violence. So this is one example. And because this is the most used common form of detecting prevalence, we have here some tips for you, both for the survey design stage and for the implementation stage. So we recommend that you use existing and validated survey instruments. You keep the length manageable, and also only collect data that you intend to analyze. It's also important that you give clear definitions and describe concrete situations of gender-based violence. And this is because victim survivors, as we said before, don't always identify a situation as falling into our definition. And always keep in mind to use inclusive language. When implementing this survey, it's important to disseminate it only using internal channels and avoid sharing the link via any social media or more openly public. So you really keep the answers straight to your institution. You can also send weekly email reminders and, of course, keep the survey open for at least 4 weeks. And finally, communicate the results to your decision-making bodies, to your institutional community, to make them feel as part of this process and to help them understand where the institution is. As an inspiring practice on prevalence, I will leave here for you the 𝐆𝐞𝐧𝐝 survey questionnaire, because it provides free templates that are accessible for everyone. So you can, if you're looking to implement a survey, you can go to this webpage and look into all of the parts that were involved in this questionnaire. Moving on to prevention. When we talk about prevention, we refer to the measures that promote changes in the social and cultural patterns of behavior of the members of our institutional community. And because prevention can cover a wide range of actions, we include here a code of conduct, for example, or policies that lay out expected behaviors and also unwanted behaviors around gender-based violence. We can also include communication materials and ongoing awareness-raising campaigns. Also, a form of prevention are trainings on bystanders, for example, and integrating this issue into teaching and research into the curricula, basically. Some tips for the P of prevention here is that you engage your communication departments so you can reach a broad audience using multiple channels. Always ensure that institutional services and your policies that are available are well communicated. It's also important to make sure that all support lines and reporting procedures are easily accessible for everyone at every moment. You may also think of targeting newcomers and provide materials for them. So, for example, incoming staff and students. And also building a prevention working group is always a good action. So designing responsibilities and responsible actors for designing and implementing these practices and activities. You may also consider as a prevention measure onboarding training for staff and students, allocating sufficient budget. And I know this may be a difficult one for a lot of you. So guaranteeing that there's enough budget for these campaigns and training programs. And of course, it's important to always assess and update the components of the prevention program, always keeping it up to date. If, for example, you wanted to focus on this P of prevention in your JEPs, you could lay out as an objective to strengthen awareness of institutional policies and reporting mechanisms. And to reach this objective, you could launch an annual awareness campaign explaining what unacceptable behaviors, support services, and procedures there are available. So just an example. I leave here for you 3 examples of prevention strategies that higher institutions have used across Europe. The first one here is from the University of Cambridge. It's called Breaking the Silence. The second one is from the University of Geneva, also designing awareness raising and campaigns describing the forms and any information that survivors may need. And the GenderSAFE guide to awareness raising campaigns. This is also a very practical tool that you can rely on. Moving on to protection. Protection aims to ensure the safety and meet the needs of victims. So it's really about ensuring that people who experience violence can access safe and confidential responses, but it also means reducing harm and preventing retaliation. That's why we always say that protection measures should be taken for all types of behaviors as soon as the institution becomes aware of the situation, and even if no formal complaint has been made. So this is why all of the protective measures that you implement should be designed to avoid potential victims, but to prevent the actual survivors from suffering harm. We also say that protection should be considered and offered regardless of where the incident takes place. So it's important to think about what type of protection we're offering to the victim survivors, both on all types of campuses, on premises, in online spaces, away from campus, such as field research activities, and also in university-related events, like, for example, a reception after a conference. It's the key to protection. Is to always keep in mind that it is determined on a case-by-case basis. So, of course, you're going to take into consideration the requirements of the situation and to provide the best possible solutions for the victim survivors. But in order to provide this, your institution needs to know that an incident has happened. That's why we always promote having anonymous reporting mechanisms, but also informal mechanisms in addition to the formal reporting mechanisms or disciplinary procedures that you all may have. And also, protection can be decided upon and provided by different people or different units in your institution. So you may decide on a specific contact person or a dedicated service, or, for example, an emergency security officer that can provide protection as a first responder. In order to implement this, it's important to have settings and procedures that allow for a quick response, to avoid procedures that require going to the supervisor or the manager first. And this is because of the power imbalances that we have in academia. This is not our first go-to solution. So avoid procedures that really involve this as having the first alternative or the first step of a procedure. Also, avoid warnings in spaces for reporting incidents because this may deter victims from actually reporting. You want to also provide complete information as much as possible. And also foresee emergency funding to allow, for example, leaving in cases that may occur during field trips or conferences away from a traditional university campus. As a GEP example, you could decide to improve your immediate institutional responses to cases of gender-based violence. And for this, some actions that you could take could be to develop an emergency response protocol with clear guidelines on how to react. But you would also need to deliver mandatory training on this protocol to employees and contractors likely to be the first responders in this case. And as an inspiring practice, I leave here for you this tool from a university in Belgium. It's an online risk assessment and monitoring screening tool. And the Speak Out from the Technical University of Dublin in Ireland, which is also a tool for reporting and disclosing incidents. Finally, we move on to prosecution. Now, prosecution refers specifically to the handling of cases by the institution. So when we talk about prosecuting cases, we talk about investigative actions, disciplinary procedures, the sanctions, and also judicial proceedings that involve external authorities or may also be included under this P. So when designing your prosecution strategy, there are some elements that you should consider. These range from having clear, accessible procedures for handling these incidents, having a reasonable timeline between the report and the finalization of the investigation, always having effective communication with all of the parties that are involved, the composition of the investigation and disciplinary committee. And this is something that I would be more than happy to talk about because we are still discussing on what is more convenient, to have only internal disciplinary committees or are external investigators also needed or helpful. And of course, always keeping sanctions as proportionate and appropriate to the situation and to the result of the investigation. We're going to talk about now some of the good practices relating to the prosecution procedures. Now, in generally, we recommend always having a separate procedure relating to gender-based violence and in regards to a normal disciplinary procedure. So, for example, if you want to address plagiarism, which is a very common form of academic misconduct, keeping procedures separate because gender-based violence has its own characteristics. So, of course, always having at hand, as I mentioned before, anonymous, informal, and formal reporting mechanisms. Always provide information on what may be considered evidence. And we recommend avoiding these joint meetings to clarify the situation, to promote conciliation as always a first resource, because it tends to go more in the direction of having the parties negotiate a solution when that may not always be the case. There may be cases where that may be a solution, but it's important to not always keep it as a first mandatory step. Also related to investigation measures, it's important that an investigation is initiated when there are consistent indications of serious suspicions. So in case of doubt, the institution should look into what has happened, what has been reported. And these procedures should be pursued even if the victim survivor has left the organization or the accused party as well. And finally, some good practice related to the sanctions itself. We always recommend keeping the procedure and the measures independent of the decision to report it to the authorities. And this is, once again, because the institution has an obligation to look into what has happened. The victim may or may not decide to report it to the police, but there needs to be institutional accountability. So moving on to some tips for this part. Again, as we said, implement monitoring mechanisms for the sanctions that are applied. So really making sure that these sanctions are effective and are being implemented. Always record all types of behaviors and all types of reports. And please do not make parties sign a non-disclosure agreement as part of resolving a complaint. And we say this because we see a lot of practices where institutions have requested victim survivors to sign these famous NDAs, and they can actually prevent victims from speaking up about their experiences. And it really contributes to a culture of secrecy that tolerates these types of behaviors within our institution. Just providing here a quick JEP example. If you were interested in, for example, strengthening institutional procedures, just in general for handling complaints, you could consider reviewing and updating your formal complaint mechanisms to include any content that you would like to, that you feel is missing. And also another action could be to set up a centralized digital recording system for all types of complaints. And I'm sure this can cause a lot of questions, and I'd be happy to talk about the importance of a centralized system for storing complaints. I leave here as an inspiring practice the policy on harassment for my own institution, Central European University, which is a private university here in Vienna. Our policy has captured all of these reporting mechanisms, and yes, it's open to the public, so you're welcome to read it. Now, we are almost finished, almost at the end, talking about provision of services. This refers to the services offered to support victim survivors, as well as the community members affected by gender-based violence. When we talk about providing these services, we refer to the professionals who are involved. So they may need, for example, specialized training, but also the existing tools that there are to assist better in addressing the needs of these groups. It could be beneficial if a central unit had oversight of all of the services available, so it can serve as a hub of services for victim survivors. It's always important that you ensure that at least one first respondent is available on all campuses if your university has more than one. Always, these services should be equipped and capable of addressing all types of these forms. Also keep in mind to offer an easily accessible booking system. For example, if you want to refer to these staffs or have in-person or virtual meetings available. As soon as an incident is reported, it's always very useful if you provide the information immediately on the services that are available. And these provision of services should not depend on the time frame of the incident. So even if it takes a while for the victim survivor to report, have these services available then. So in addition to all of these, we can have also offering psychological support or first aid guidance. And as we said, also offering guide to first responders on how they can act immediately. As a GEP example, you could decide to aim for providing with victim survivors with external support services. And as an action, you could make your resources provided by the local government on gender-based violence available to all the university community in English. So just as an example to start thinking about the services. And we have here as an inspiring practice, the University of Dundee, these supports for students who are dealing with gender-based violence, and the help desk from the University of Bologna. Moving on to partnerships, and I promise only partnerships and policies are left, so hang in there with me. Partnerships refer to the involvement of actors at all levels. So you might think of liaising with local government, agencies, civil society organizations, also the private sector. So it's important to know that external partnerships can complement the available skill sets and competences that are available within your institution. So if there's anything that you would like to strengthen, consider this P of partnerships. And as an example, you could try to leverage funding opportunities to support these partnerships, build informal networks with key actors, of course, joining in European networks, alliances, international projects. But also, we'd like to stress on avoid relying on unpaid volunteers. So please formalize and recognize these functions and not just rely on people's time on volunteering. If you wanted to incorporate this P of partnerships into your GEP, you could develop partnerships with specialist organizations. And let's say you were trying to focus on migrant women, your action could consist of establishing formal collaborations with NGOs, migrant support organizations, and counseling services. I leave you here this inspiring practice from the UK, which is called the Ask for Angela program, implemented across several university campuses and to raise awareness, and also bars and different restaurants. And this Wide We Did Not Report initiative, which has been developed by Charles University in Prague in association with different student associations. And finally, the P of policies. So we leave this for the end because we feel that it encompasses and summarizes and is the base for all of the other Ps. So when we talk about policies, we talk about frameworks as a coherent set of measures that actually have a strategy with an integral vision on addressing gender-based violence. But we also talk about the actual policy documents, these documents that explicitly say what the organization's commitments are. And these, of course, can take different forms. Now, that's why before this training, we asked you to take a look to what your institution has. So maybe you have found protocols or action plans, or maybe you have a specific policy on harassment, on gender-based violence, and these can take many forms. It's important that these policies are aligned with the regional, national, and European legal frameworks. As we mentioned before, that you saw that there are different levels of obligations and different legal sources behind having institutional policies. Also, to start from a good understanding of what your context is. So understanding your structure, the culture, the resources that are available for you are essential before you can even start designing a policy. And of course, as always, engage your stakeholders. So this also applies, I believe, to the work that you're doing on currently with GEPs. So really engage them in co-creation activities to grasp what they want, what they need out of this policy, and what the policy can actually look like and be implemented successfully. Of course, any policy that you sanction on gender-based violence has to address all forms of this violence. And this includes all of the forms that we were talking about before. So psychological, physical violence, economic violence. It's also clear that you should establish what your values are and your desired behavior, but as well as what is considered misconduct or inappropriate behavior in a learning and teaching context. And of course, making sure that all members of the organization are aware that these policies exist. And as an inspiring practice, I would like to talk to you about our model policy framework. Now, within the context of GenderSAFE, we have developed a policy that covers all of the 7 Ps, ensuring and operationalizing this holistic approach. It basically serves as a resource for higher institutions to provide clear provisions on how to prevent, address, and respond to gender-based violence. We drafted this policy at the beginning of the project, and right now it has 16 sections that cover 49 articles, so it's a very long document. Again, as we said, it covers everything that we believe right now an institution should have. So definitions, commitments, all the types of reporting procedures, protection measures, support services, trainings, and of course, the monitoring and review of the policy itself. So if your question is right now, I want to address gender-based violence in my institution, I know that it exists, but I don't know what my policy should say, then I highly recommend checking this document. And it's available here on the webpage as well, so that's why I leave the link for you. But please know that it's also a work in progress, because it will be one of our deliverables at the end of the project. We have right now members of our community of practice testing the content of this policy. So they have taken sections back to their institutions, are trying to implement what it says, and now we're still learning from their experiences. So if you read it, if you go into the document and feel that there's anything that in your institution wouldn't apply or that would be difficult to implement, you can go ahead and write to us. Also in the webpage, there's an email address. You can, of course, always reach out to me and we can discuss. Because as I said, it's a work in progress that we're trying to improve and have ready by the end of GenderSAFE. So this is it for the 7 Ps, and I will stop here. Just to know that in the presentation that you will receive, I will leave for you the links to the UNICEF toolkit, where all of these Ps and resources and elements are further explained, and you also have all of the outputs from that project itself, as well as all of these links and resources that may be helpful for you in your day-to-day action in your work in your institutions. So I think this is it for me. Do I still have anyone with me? Did you all fall asleep?
Thank you, Diana. Thank you for this rich presentation. It was very helpful, and thanks a lot for sharing your experiences. It's very helpful for us. Maybe we open the floor to participants for any questions before we go to the break. And I find the time also to welcome you to stay after the break and stay with us at the breakout rooms in order to discuss all together some practices from your institutions as well. Please do not leave and leave us alone. And I will stop the recording now.